they start distracting you. So that's what I was meaning, you know, by the more you refine, the more things start popping up that you need to fix. So just keep in mind it's a slippery slope. Also, if you render one area to a super high level of finish, then you know the rest might look a bit strange, or strangely, you know, bad in comparison if you sort of just leave them a lot looser. So I recommend you kind of pick up level of finish you're going with and then stick with it. And you know, because it is, you know, as I said, it's kind of a decision to how far you take it. At least that's what it is when, you know, you've trained a little bit and you have a grasp on how to refine things further, even when things feel finished to a beginner, let's say. So I feel like I can move on from this area, and this is why I hopped down here, because this is a bit of a laborsome area with all this patchiness and soft transition. So, but you know, we're making good progress. So maybe here we should actually decide again on which area we're actually working on. Maybe this smaller shape here, so we don't just bounce around. We can just kind of really hone in on that. So maybe now you can see, you know, this is pretty much the main way I grip my pencil. It's from the very back. So I can, you know, use a lot of arm movements as well. I'm not going like this because we don't want the pencil to glide over all the cracks. In this rendering stage, we really want to go into the cracks and color those in if necessary. So this is how I'm kind of used to working. I also use this grip a lot when I'm painting. So I think this is a point where we should actually address this area, probably with the darker HB pencil, because I noticed this isn't dark enough compared to the reference we have there. So let's just try to kind of nicely darken things over here to create this sort of transition. You can then refine it, you know, later with the right edges, but at least we have, you know, some of the information in. We can push the dark edges a little bit further to this side because that's what we're seeing. Also, I think this shadow kind of comes a little bit further down, so let's just indicate that a little bit. And the tone is a little bit wider over here, so it's looking a little bit more like that. Kind of feathers off to the left a little bit more as well. So yeah, you'll notice things you kind of missed in the earlier stages, and it's okay. As I said before, you know, just tackle them when you meet them, especially when you're working this area. And yeah, fixing and reassessing is entirely normal. Don't get frustrated with it. It's honestly just a huge part of painting and drawing in general. Like, even the masters can't take a blank. Even the masters can't take a blank piece of paper or canvas and, you know, place every mark perfectly. They'll have to fix things and nudge things, and maybe they do it quite effortlessly or seemingly effortlessly, but still, you know, no mark is well, maybe a mark can be perfect from the start, sure, but and you can build around it, but don't sort of go expecting it. It's a stroke of luck, I would say, if the mark is absolutely perfect and in the perfect place and everything on a stark white canvas, you know. That's not how it works. So we work by comparison, and there's nothing to compare when we're very rough in the early stages. The point of this whole thing was, don't stress about it. You'll have to fix things. When you need to fix things, don't be like, oh shucks, I made a mistake. Just, you know, all right, we found it, that's good. Now let's fix it. If it's something major, you know, you have to shift everything over a little bit or whatever, it still happens, you know. It's super annoying. Maybe you need to take a little break, but don't let it, you know, get the best of you. It happens to everyone. You know, like maybe in the big form modeling stage, you realize this is, you know, 0.5 centimeter too wide, and you have to just readjust everything and sort of redo a lot of the drawing. Shouldn't happen because you measure things very carefully at the start, but you know, sometimes things do happen, especially if you skip a step or something like that. So do try to put a lot of care and attention into the early stages. I know there's a lot of things to think about, but I'm just gonna tell you to think about one more thing again. Just remember to think about what the form you're trying to create is actually. You know what this is the, you know, erector spinae, long back muscle, and it's a round kind of tube shape, so that's what we want to convey here. We don't want to just visually try to match things, because that's also one way of getting things wrong. If you only think visually, you know, it's a good way to start off with, but you know, when you're trying to really go into the nuances, you can't really tell super small and soft things simply by comparing at the very start, at least, because your eye isn't refined yet. So this area is at the very edge of the form, you know, kind of turning away. I can notice from here maybe it's not paper white actually in any place, so I'm just giving it a very light tone. Probably the same thing for this area here. I'm just trying to get rid of the stark white paper a little bit. Yeah, not going crazy because it's not gray, it's just not pure white. Here there's a couple of these stark white little dots that we want to get rid of, so it's a bit cleaner. They're more distracting when you look from further away, so lean back a little bit. You can usually instantly tell which spots need to be toned a little bit. And now it's less distracting, so we can carry on. Maybe there's some darker spots that need, again, accounting for. After we fill some lighter things, they pop up. Here I'm noticing I'm destroying the shapes a little bit too much, so you know, we can see these things are pretty much horizontally aligning, so maybe actually I've pushed this edge a little bit too far to the left. It's not as thick anymore, this dark shape on the edge, which resulted it in looking a little bit too wide over here on the light shape, which makes it look shorter, which is, I guess, why I was pushing it higher, sort of unconsciously, to the upwards. Can't English while I'm drawing, it seems. Okay, and you know, these are still not aligning. Also the edge isn't correct, or the drawing, sorry, isn't correct. It's a bit more slanted, this one. Okay, that's fine for me. Don't mind it too much. But as we know, we probably want to correct a little bit of both rather than just one thing. It's pretty unlikely it's only the left side that is problematic and this is perfect, so it's probably not. Probably we need to just nudge this a little bit higher. Now it already seems, just by softening a little bit towards the shadow there, the shape feels a bit more in line with what we're seeing. Very simple. Just needs to be paid attention to. Okay, I think this side is more or less done over here, so let's just carry on in here. Just check which pencil I'm holding. Let's not use the HB for that area. So this needs to be a little bit darker in here. Well, quite a bit darker actually. And then we can make it turn towards the right side here. So the transition here kind of carries on all the way over here. We're pretty far off, so let's just push the whole kind of tone all the way. Maybe we can make a mark, you know, where we want to kind of end the transition. So stone is super light already, so just want to soften things in the end. We want to be subtle, but we don't want it to be sort of invisible to the naked eye, you know. We want to still be drawing and kind of conveying information to the viewer, not just flexing on our skills to make very light marks on the paper. So try to make these things visible. It might not be a case of it being too dark or too light, but also it might be just softening. It's a bit of a touchy-feely kind of thing, I know, but you'll get the hang of it once you start actually, thinking about it more. People say, the values are the most important thing for realism, which is true. You can make a thing appear three-dimensional with only values, but if you really want to strive for naturalism as well as realism, then I think the edges and transitions are pretty much the next most important thing. Like the values, you can just basically put in blocky planes and it still reads as an object, of 3 dimensions. That's just how they convey information. But edges, lost edges, sharp edges, firm edges, all this kind of stuff, they really sell the illusion of reality. So with edges, you can really manipulate how one imagines, let's say, the eye would see. Can make things softer in the back, sharper in the front. This already creates a pretty nice illusion of depth. We'll be using that when we tackle the still lifes. All right, little by little. I think it's time to take a break. Again, it gets a bit strenuous after a while. Okay, before we continue working on this area, maybe let's take a look at the upper section a little bit, so we can then sort of call this area finished. I'm pretty happy with this transition area here, but let's tackle the other side. Since I already worked this part, but not really the lower bit so much. Yeah, staring at the very small things on the paper can be a bit tiring for your eyes. So take some, micro breaks. Spend like 20 seconds staring at something else, just a distance. I can look at the trees outside my window, so that's a nice thing. Yeah, I think that's good for now. It's clearly conveying the roundness of the shape there, so can be a good way to work, where you sort of work work an initial pass to the point where you're kind of happy with an area, then move to the next one, and after the next one you go back to the other area and fix anything that kind of obviously pops at you. For me it's just maybe that this is not the cleanest of tones, so I'm just trying to sort of look for those white worms of the paper texture again, and maybe any darker spots we want to address. But yeah, there could be a little bit more dark turning tone on here. There's this kind of little sort of wider shape of that happening as well, so maybe that'll help us with the form a little bit. When I'm toning something a bit darker with the harder pencil, I'm allowing a little bit more pressure. So actually there's anything visible happening, because you know, if I do the same amount of pressure on the very light spots, of course it's gonna be too much too quickly. Starting this area by cleaning up some obvious dark points I dislike, and maybe while we're at it we'll just refine the bedbug line a little bit over here. So when we're doing this we try not to go into the lights, because if we kind of go to that side, especially in here, the place we just rendered, we just have to sort of transition everything if we start working too much into the light shapes. We should, in theory, make sure the bedbug line is correct before we start rendering these things, and that's exactly why, because then we'll have to fix everything afterwards if we first render and then fix the bedbug line. So maybe that's what was actually the issue for me. I should have checked before, but you know, it's part of the process. Okay, maybe going a bit too hard on this. So try to use the HB for the shadow rendering kind of stuff. Just is a bit more precise when you can get something down in a single stroke, rather than, you know, having to kind of tone it in with repeated strokes. Also to mention, I'm just not gonna work on the outline anymore. It's part of the rendering stage, you know, making it super nice and neat. If there's fuzzy things like this kind of popping out of the line, I can just crisp it up a little bit, but I won't really go over them again at this point, with the exception of maybe these areas where there's, you know, tone next to it. But I'll try not to, you know, redraw everything just for the sake of making it sharper. You should do it because it'll make for a nicer drawing, but I think you don't need to be demonstrated on how to make outlines anymore, since we spent a good portion of our time doing that already. Also, I don't really find working on the outlines so fun, so I enjoy the rendering part more. Right, I think we're pretty happy with that side. So going over, we've done this area, this area, this area, this area, this area, both glutes. This I don't feel really needs any work. It's just a light kind of smudge, basically super soft. Just needs to be barely visible. So I think on the statue itself, this is the only area that we have to render. Maybe we'll do a light pass on the pedestal, but I won't really be too picky with that, since it's mostly just flat tone with these kind of darker things towards the edges. Speaking of the pedestal, we could put that thing in this kind of cracked thing. That's the wrong position. Let's just try to perhaps it's somewhere over there. this could be part of the plane stage. That's why I'm instantly trying to put it in there. And it's basically kind of described by the tones around it rather than maybe there's a little bit of a defining kind of outline on this right edge because it's kind of casting a shadow when the light is coming from the right side. So there's a little indication of that. Okay, we don't need more than that for now. So yeah, let's just let's finish this area and then we'll see what we'll do next. Just keeping in mind I'm using the right pencil, which is 2H for the lights. And again, just hopping right into that work, but I should probably just refine the bedbug line a little bit here. There's not much of a bedbug line happening there, you know, it's not clear, there's just a kind of darker tone with some random variation. There's a little bit of a lighter tone on the left side where there's a bit of reflected light. If we don't see it, we can put it there because we know it's happening there. It's just how light works. Also, there's a bit of reflected light in these parts, so it would naturally be happening also on the back of the thigh there. So yeah, perhaps this shadow area needs to be a little bit darker towards the edge. So let's darken it now rather than later, because then we would have to redraw the transition again. Doesn't have to be much more than that. Since we're here, we can just make sure the tone is kind of even. But the next stage, which is rendering the darks, will be for that. Just, you can mess around a little bit with those, but just don't get carried away, because we want to keep things, you know, controlled, where we work on certain things in certain stages, and then the next steps. In graphite, you know, it doesn't really matter, but we're training this whole routine just because we're using it for the whole process of going through this course. The steps will be valid even in the painting stages, and as you know, paint acts quite differently from graphite. It actually dries up, you have to mix the paints and all that stuff, so we can't really just go everywhere, because, you know, if we work a little bit in here one session in painting, hop here mid session, and then work a little bit here, we'll have 3 things that will dry up by the next session, and all of them will be unrefined because we just kind of didn't finish them. So we really have to work one area at a time when we're rendering things in paint. And that's again for this approach. There are many approaches, you know, almost as many as there are painters, but this is an approach meant for learning this stuff. So if you wish to learn it, I recommend you stick with it and don't improvise too much. You know, improvise if you have to, due to any limiting factors, but I recommend you just try it for what it is first, and then, you know, start turning it into your own process if this is the only approach you've learned. So this here is a cast shadow. The reason it's not super sharp is because it starts sort of creating a penumbra, which is a sort of softer edge, half shadow, some people call it, towards the further away from the source of the cast shadow it is. But at the start it's quite sharp. So right here, this is the form casting the shadow. Here it's a bit sharper, the distance is wider here, so sharpening the edges of cast shadows is something we can do because that gives us a bit of variety. One thing sometimes happens also is, you know, students start learning about edges and softness, and everything starts turning into a cotton ball. They become a little bit afraid of making things sharp, at least in our school. So everything is super soft. That said, the most common critique by Jared was make things softer, so I guess it was still not enough, you know. Okay, let's make it a little bit darker turning here, so let's make the form a little bit more apparent. A very simple and a very effective test for knowing if you have it turning enough is ask yourself, is it turning? If you need to ask that question, then it's not turning enough. It should be apparent from the first glance. So if you need to ask if it's turning, then make it turn more. And saying make it turn, I mean turn the form, turn it around, you know. So bark drawing like this, especially the rendering, is horrible for your posture, so try to, you know, move a little bit when you're taking breaks. You know, at least in charcoal you're working a bit larger, you don't have to zoom into tiny paper cracks all the time, and painting you're using a longer brush and all that stuff, so you don't really have to lean into the paper so much. I think here's a little smudge of something on the paper, maybe it's just graphite that doesn't really lift off. And here I just kind of, I guess I poked the paper by accident with a very sharp tip, so it kind of left the score on the paper with a dark tone in there. So, you know, you want to treat your paper right. If you bend it or crinkle it, it won't forgive you. It will just forever stay that way unless you have some great conservation skills. Okay, coming back to the previous area again, as I said, just need to make things softer around here. Okay, let's pick up our mouse stick so we don't have to get into weird positions to rest the hand. That's what this thing is for. So, okay, let's take a break to reevaluate with a fresh eye. All right, after the break, I took a peek and I feel this edge was kind of straightened out a little bit too much during the rendering of the transition, so I'll try to subtly push this a little bit back, you know. Maybe it won't work too well, but maybe it will, so just lighten the turning tone and push the edge of the shadow a little bit so we can then have this appear a little bit more round again. I think this area here in particular is the culprit. It's a bit closer. Now there's a little bit more of a distinct curve to the shadow edge there, but I think we still need to lighten from here a little bit. I think I'll find this kneaded eraser. It will do a little bit of a better job if I just lightly kind of use a fan-like shape to sort of nudge the edge a little bit back. And then we can just go back with the 2H and just touch the edges again, or the transition, sorry. Whenever you take something off with an eraser, it's bound to be a little bit patchy afterwards. So just, you know, refine things a little bit more. We don't really like to erase graphite because it never sort of leaves an even finish. And it's less controlled than adding more on. Okay, well, I think that's better. It's not perfect, but we'll leave it at that. So we can then do a little bit of work on the pedestal. I won't do much, but you know, I'll try to make it look a little bit more, you know, finished. The nice thing about this pedestal is that we can actually, you know, leave it a bit rougher since it only kind of heightens the difference in material maybe. This is a very soft kind of, let's say very smoothed out sort of thing, and this pedestal probably is a little bit more roughly chopped and maybe, you know, it's banged up against some things over time. as it's been moved from place to place and all this kind of stuff. So it appears to have this, you know, chip over there and some other details that indicate it's a bit worn, you know. Mostly what I'm looking for here is just, you know, get the tones right so it looks more like what's in the picture. We can also kind of indicate these small undulations and nuances, like this corner kind of inching towards the left, like this top side as well. You can take your time and make this as perfect as you want, but I don't think this is very, you know, instructive to anyone to look at me working on this part, since it's not really that complicated. It's just basically a box kind of shape and has some texture to it. What I mostly want to appear right is the transition into the cast itself, maybe, or the statue. I'm not sure if that's marble or plaster cast. Maybe it was plaster cast, but I think they had casts in the French Academy, not like actual marble sculptures. So since these bark drawings are derived from the casts that were at the French Academy, and the bark drawing course was initially, you know, developed for the French Academy too. Or at least that region. I'm not sure if the Academy itself used it, but you know, regardless, it was developed to help the students. Kind of intentionally did this hatchy sort of thing there. We can have a little bit of this kind of pattern going on there. Maybe here we can sort of refine this plane a little bit, since it's gotten a little bit unclear maybe with all these passes. Just clean it up a little bit.